5 seconds.
Yes.
Okay. Hello and welcome to the After Hours show with the Autonomous Collective. This is Joe in Norway, filling in for Walter and Lane. Walter's out in the wilds of the Yukon, dodging forest fires and grizzly bears. We hope he stays safe. And Lane's a bit under the weather. We hope he gets well. But we've got a special show this evening. We have Professor Ann Lee will be speaking about the Ukraine, and our main guest here will be a conversation with Henry Hakamäki, friend of the show, on his new book, Stalin, History and the Critique of a Black Legend, with Salvatore, Engel-Di, Mauro, and David Peat. Later on, Annika will be breaking down some of the misconceptions about white privilege and what it looks like in real life, how a lot of it is subtle, but also not. And I'll be doing some sort of take on, we'll be doing a Georgian dish for kitchen ASMR. I thought, since we're dealing with Stalin this evening, I was thinking in Soviet Russia, kitchen cooks you, but I'll be cooking some Georgian dishes that were more appealing to Stalin's taste. We'll be making a Badrijani Nigvzi, which is a roasted eggplant with walnut paste and garnished with pomegranate, or maybe something more local to where I am. But I'd like to introduce our guest this evening. So first up will be Professor Ann Lee. She's a retired college professor and community member at the Daily Kos. She's a member of the National Council of Independent Scholars and is a contributor to the book, The Political Economy of Art, Making the Nation of Culture. And we also have Professor Jonathan Bick. He is a former professor of political science and an interest in comparative politics, American politics, and survey research and public opinion. And returning friend of the show, Henry Hakamäki, is a co-host of the Guerrilla History podcast and co-translator and editor of the authorized new translation of Domenico Lasurgio's Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend. Welcome, everyone. Bring Henry in here.
Hello, hello.
We get Henry in there?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, on the spotlight.
He should be spotlighted. Yep.
Oh, okay. There he is. Hey, Henry. How are you? Welcome to the COVID pod that never ended. we've changed a little bit of the furniture and some of the faces, maybe, but it's still going. We're glad to have you around. I thought, since I can't host and cook at the same time, so I'm just going to get right into the food and then let you guys all have a discussion on Henry's new book. So what I've got here this evening, I was looking at the famous Soviet cookbook, and it was a little maybe too meat heavy for our all vegetarian focus here. And since Stalin is from Georgia and he preferred a little bit more flavor and freshness, I thought I'd go with something more in line with that. And what we've got going on is a roasted eggplant dish. or fried eggplant. Basically, I'll be slicing the eggplant into thin strips and frying them. And I'll make a pate out of the walnuts here with garlic, cayenne pepper, Lane's favorite here, coriander seeds in seed form, not to be confused with the fresh cilantro type of coriander that we're also familiar with. And then I'm supposed to be using blue fenugreek, but I don't have that. So I'll be using fenugreek leaves and regular old methi fenugreek. Grind that up, mix this with some vinegar. And traditionally it's supposed to be, we'll roll the eggplant strips in a pate and then garnish with pomegranate. But what ended up happening today was we took a stroll out in the forest and ended up with some wonderful wild blueberries. We had our trusty little blueberry picker and our hands, and we harvested a load. So I thought kind of a similar flavor profile of the sour, tart, and a little sweet. And also bright color to contrast with the other elements. So I'll be making some kind of blueberry reduction and then garnish with some fresh blueberries as we for the presentation. So I'll get to cooking and I'll leave everyone to discuss Henry's new book, and I may butt in here and there as needed, whether to talk about where I am with the food or to ask a question in the interview.
Hey, thanks, Joe.
Time. Thank you.
Welcome, Henry. It's really been a long time, and we're really happy that you could spare some time to visit with us. You have a new book, a translation of Domenico Losordo. I hope I got that correct.
Close enough.
On Stalin, and aside from jokes about how African Americans might be misled to read the book because it's about a Black legend. Other than that, tell us how you got to this project. It's a really interesting, kind of idea, especially since, as I hope that we'll begin to talk about the general problem, I think, which those of us on the left have and have had for decades, is questions of how to talk about Stalin.
Yeah, it's a great question. And before I get to the answering of that, I just want to mention that Joe in Norway is making one of the dishes that we had at my wedding. For those who didn't follow me on Twitter back at the time, I got married in Georgia. And so on the wedding night, we brought our wedding witnesses to a nice little Georgian restaurant to say thanks for signing our paper for us. And we had a feast, and that was one of the dishes that was present on the traditional Georgian feast table. So I'm really looking forward to seeing it. It'll bring back some memories.
Wonderful to hear. I hope I do it justice.
Oh, it's already looking good. So I guess to get to the conversation at hand, the question of why I picked up this project is a really interesting one, and one that I talked at length about when we did our recording on guerrilla history about this book, but I'll try to be a little bit more brief here. So essentially what happened is that this book was written a little bit over a decade ago by Domenico Losordo in Italian. This book made quite a splash in Italy. It had quite a few people that were very interested in it and gained a lot of fame upon in the Italian left, and also some infamy amongst the more liberal community within Italy. Eventually, it was translated into Spanish and Portuguese and a few other languages here or there, but it was never officially translated into English. This is where my story comes in. A few years ago, I contacted a well-known left-wing book publisher who will remain anonymous right now, who had published several other of Losordo's books, specifically Liberalism, War and Revolution, and they have a couple others that are in the works to come out. I had heard about this book, but at that time it was presented to me as if it was a biography, which it really is not at all a biography of Stalin, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about what it actually is in a little bit. But I had emailed this publisher to ask if they had plans of translating it into English and releasing it, because I knew I really wanted to, read it in English. And I'm sure I knew that there was a lot of other people who were really interested in it as well. So I sent in this polite email. The person who answered the email said, great question. We've published several of Losurdo's works, and they've been quite popular as releases from that publishing house. And so they'll forward the email to their managing editor. At which point I received an email from their managing editor, which was insulting, aggressive, derogatory. And actually, because it was so insulting, I took a screenshot and put it on Twitter, and it was my first viral tweet. I had a very small Twitter account at that time, but I mean, it would have been one thing to just say, no, we're not interested in it. And fair enough. Not every publishing house has to publish every book that comes their way. I would have just said, yeah, whatever. But it was a very aggressive and insulting response to a very, very polite question. I mean, I also put a screenshot of my question out there so people could see I wasn't like baiting him into anything. And so that got a little bit of traction online. And Ben Stanky, who is one of the folks at the Center for Communist Studies, which their imprint is Iskra Books, the publisher of the book that we just put out, he contacted me. I've known Ben for a little while, and he said, Henry, why don't you take this project on? And I said, sure, not knowing how much work that was going to be. After a few months of slogging through rough translation work, I knew that I needed a collaborator, at which point I contacted Salvatore, who's one of my best friends and, just a fantastic scholar. For people who are not familiar with Salvatore, he's the author of Socialist States and the Environment, which is really one of my favorite books, and is editor of Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, which is a really great journal as well. So I contacted him and said, Salvatore, you're a native Italian speaker. Help me, please. And he was more than happy to jump in. And about a year after that point, we got to the point where we could publish, and here we are today. So I guess that's the first part of the question. The second part of your question, in terms of Stalin, is a very tricky subject in terms of how to discuss it if you're on the left. That was one of the other reasons why we wanted to pick this up. This book orients Stalin and orients his some of his decisions historically, contextually, in an all-around comparative analysis, which is what Losurdo calls his analytical method regarding Stalin. And really, it's just historical materialism 101, looking at all of these different modes of analysis and orienting things historically, looking at the material conditions. And this book is really important for us because whenever we are faced with challenges, anti-left, anti-communist, anti-socialist, whatever, anti-us challenges, often the name of Stalin is invoked as a canard to just say, look, these people are on the left. That's like Stalin. Stalin was bad. Therefore, these people are bad and all of their ideas are bad. I mean, it's that same argument that we've seen for decades. And this book does a lot to orient Stalin historically so that we're able to combat these really simplistic narratives in a way that we can say, hey, of course, we're not saying that Stalin was perfect and he did everything right and blah, blah, blah. Losurdo himself says the terror, the horror of certain decisions many times in this book. But it allows us to use these different analytical methods of comparison, of, utilizing the material forces that were present at the time, to really be able to say, this is not some exceptional evil that's taking place here. This is, something that actually fits logically within that period of time under the material conditions that they were facing. Sorry for being so lengthy with that answer.
No, it isn't. I think what the most important thing about your book is that it gives us a reason to go sort out the timeline, to work through the kind of historical questions. And I found it personally interesting because since Losurdo is also a Hegel scholar, he kind of works through some of the historical elements and doesn't get us sidetracked onto various secondary issues that actually bog down political organization, for example. So yeah. I would say, it's a wonderful book. I mean, the best books to me are the ones that compel you to read other books, and particularly try and work through a kind of factual timeline, a kind of to understand the sweep of history that he's working through. But I had some other questions about this, because it did seem, as I was reading through it, and of course getting towards the end, is to understand, and if you could fill in some of the gaps for us, is how is Losurdo seen within the context of Italian communism? It seems as though he had an audience in mind in writing this, as he does for some of his other texts. And it seemed that he was trying to address some very specific issues relative to, for example, the Khrushchev 1956 so-called secret speech, et cetera.
Yeah, secret speech. And just to point out that you mentioned that Losurdo was a Hegelian. He was, I believe, the president of the Hegelian International. So, this is somebody who is very well respected, well regarded. He's a real philosopher of ideas. And so when we're talking about his analytical methods, we're not talking about somebody who's just grasping at things here and there. We're talking about somebody with a rigorous analytical method. There's well over 1,000 in-text citations in this book. If you look in the references at the back, there's like 346 different references that are utilized in this book. I counted them up the other day. I tweeted the number out. It's like 346 or something along those lines. It's a lot. And from people, I just to make sure that we're clear here, the vast majority of the sources that he's using are sources that are directly opposed to Stalin, very anti-Stalin scholars, anti-Stalin sources. He utilizes the CIA, he utilizes Khrushchev, he utilizes Trotsky, he utilizes modern historians that are very anti-Soviet and anti-Stalin in particular. These are the sources that he's relying on most heavily to do this analysis, where he's orienting things with relation to what the society was like before Stalin was there, before the Soviet Union began, what with regards to the internal tensions that were present within the Soviet Union during that time, external forces that were acting on the Soviet Union compared to other major states that were operating in the world at that time, to see, was Stalin some exceptional figure in the world at that period of time, compared to other states after that period of time. Like, he's really taking in all of these different modes of analysis to put this comprehensive analysis together. And so with regards to your question on how Losurdo is viewed, Losurdo was very highly regarded within the Italian communist left in Italy. He was very high up in the Italian Communist Party in terms of, being kind of like a thought leader. He was an activist for many, many years, associated with various communist parties in Italy. People outside of Italy as well that were looking to the Italian communists for inspiration, they would usually utilize his work. And in terms of the audience that he's looking for, he's really writing. So it's actually one of the flaws of this book, I think, is that this book is intended for people who are on the left, want to utilize the narrative that he's putting forth in this book to be able to oppose this really lazy, reductive anti-Stalinism that's used to bash anybody on the left. It's targeted for people like this to utilize. It's written in a very academic manner. That's one of my criticisms of this work, is that it seems to me as if and I've read other works of Losurdo, and this is something that is not just present in this book, it's present in most of his books, is that he writes in a pretty academic way, even when it should be targeted for people to utilize in argumentation against anti-left forces. But in terms of who should be reading it, I think that this is a really important book. I think that this is a book that for anybody on the left, regardless of your personal thoughts on Stalin, this is a book that you need to be able to take the message of and take these arguments of, so that when you're confronted with this really reductive anti-Stalinism that then presents itself as just being anti-left more generally, you have these arguments that Losurdo works out over the course of this book, over the course of like 380 pages, to be able to combat effectively this really lazy argument, which unfortunately has a lot of sway over people who don't know much about this period of time, don't know much about what was going on inside and outside of the Soviet Union, the pressures that were there, what the Soviet Union or what Russia was like before the Soviet period. It's really important that you take these things on so that these lazy arguments aren't effective. They shouldn't be. They're lazy, but we have to have this information to be able to combat it. So I think that it's a really important book for people that are in activist circles, organizing circles, really anybody on the left, regardless of your thoughts of Stalin. But if you are not explicitly anti-Stalin yourself, then this is really a critical book because it will arm you with a lot of these arguments to utilize using these different modes of analysis that Losurdo puts forth in his all-around comprehensive analysis.
Yes, it provides a variety, I think, of entry points to a variety of arguments relative to the terror, to the purge, to the productivity of collectivism, and a variety of other topics that are incredibly important and often used in a simplified way to negate a particular argument. And there a lot of them are simply either bad premises or are based on a whole variety of right and left propaganda about Stalin. And I think that the advantage of reading this book is to situate Stalin within that historical discourse, to understand, yes, of course, there's a terror, but there was other things going on at the same time. There was a whole set of organizations going on at the same time.
Yeah.
Yes, some people got purged, but you can't reduce things down to the kind of simplified arguments about, so for example, the Hitler-Stalin comparison, which is incredibly problematic one and often resorted to by the right. And I think this helps us straighten out what the criteria are for measuring one against the other. I mean, it is horrible regardless. That entire historical period is horrible in that sense. But there are details, I think, that Losurdo allows us to sort of get into. It's a kind of creates a kind of continuity or a retroactive continuity that allows us to see Stalin within a kind of a through line that's important. Also, his relations as are often described as between other diplomatic characters, like with Churchill or FDR. I think these are important points because often I think you just get often to these, that you meet people who have really weird arguments. Like, for example, Trotsky was in America, so therefore we should be more affiliated with Trotsky simply because he was in America for a short period of time.
Yeah. So something I want to make sure that I make clear before I get too deep into the conversation and the people that are listening don't actually even know what the book is about. Yes. I mentioned earlier that this is not a biography of Stalin and that we're talking about these arguments of situating certain decisions or actions of the Stalin administration in various ways. What this book is really, I think that if you were going to, try to classify this book into one genre of book, it's a historiographic media analysis more so than anything. We are talking about the history. We are talking a little bit about the decisions that were made, but really what this book mostly is an analysis of the portrayal and media portrayal in particular of Stalin over the course of decades. So something that is often brought up on the left, but is not as deeply as examined as it is in this book, is that during World War II, to many Americans, Joseph Stalin was Uncle Joe. We got along with him. He was very, like, a lot of people know this, particularly on the left. Maybe a lot of liberals and conservatives don't know that Americans had a pretty favorable opinion of Stalin during World War II, but that's the case. It was a very favorable opinion. Especially amongst the working class in the United States. But this changes over time. What Losurdo is doing is analyzing why this portrayal and narrative surrounding Stalin is changing over the course of decades and how they changed that portrayal of Stalin and then people's perception of Stalin. So really what this is doing is looking at how the perception of Stalin changed over time in the collective West, with a particular focus on Britain and the United States, but it's the collective West. and how the West was able to do these things, that was able to change the perceptions of Stalin. So again, we're utilizing sources from newspapers, magazines, direct quotations from world leaders, direct quotations from people who had high standing in the world society, like Gandhi. We're utilizing quotations from these individuals to show that, hey, up until World War II, there was not really a negative portrayal of Stalin, and there wasn't very many negative feelings in the US beyond the typical, like, ooh, scary socialism, but there was nothing inherently anti-Stalin in terms of the feeling at that time. During World War II, the portrayals of Stalin were quite positive and the feelings of Stalin were quite positive. And for the first couple of years out of World War II, the feelings were still very positive. It really changed, particularly when we got to the not so secret speech of Khrushchev, which, as history has showed, was really Khrushchev's attempt to consolidate the I don't want to say consolidate power, because that comes with certain connotations, but let's say that he consolidated his position within the ruling apparatus of the Soviet Union. He consolidated the narrative in a way that it would be so that he would be, above Stalin in terms of, oh, look at this abuser Stalin, look at this madman Stalin. Look, I'm here to rectify these wrongs that were perpetuated over the last 2 decades. That is something that we've been able to see with subsequent analyses of that secret speech. And it's something that even the CIA pretty much admitted was going to happen. So it's something that I've quoted on Twitter before, on the Guerrilla History episode that we did about the Stalin book, on another episode another interview that we did recently with Millennials Are Killing Capitalism about the book that'll be coming out any day now. So what this quote was from the CIA, it was an internal document in 1953 talking about on the transition of power after Stalin's death. It was written in the weeks after Stalin's death. You can find it very easily online because it's a declassified internal document. So keep in mind, who would know better about the dynamics inside the Soviet Union besides the people inside maybe the presidium of the Soviet Union than the CIA? The CIA knew everything that was happening in the Soviet Union at that time. And let's not pretend that they're evil, but they're not stupid, right? Like the CIA actually does know things, even if they're evil. Let's not fool ourselves here. So who would know better about what was going on than the CIA themselves? And this was an internal document. This was not meant to be used for propaganda purposes in the public. This was meant for CIA operatives and CIA leadership to circulate amongst themselves so that they could understand that situation at that time. The very first line of the document said, the portrayal of the Soviet Union under Stalin as some like autocratic dictatorship is flat out false, and that collective leadership was practiced during Stalin's time. If you want, I can pull up the direct quotation. I have it saved on my phone. But that's the first line of the document. Like the CIA knew that, and then 1 or 2 lines later, they go ahead and say, unless there is some major change or some major event that happens, there is no way that Khrushchev's standing within the Soviet Union and his standing in the minds of the people of the Soviet Union will equal or surpass that of Stalin. There is no possible way for that to happen, barring some unforeseen, remarkable event that would come out. The secret speech was that event. It was put together in a way that it would knock Stalin down. Hey, look at all of the secret information that we have that, we're going to release, even though that information turned out in large part to be false, as documented by numerous scholars. One recommendation that has come out, the book came out in the last couple of years, is it's an Italian book, just like the original Stalin book. So, I don't think that it's been translated into English yet. So I'm sorry that I'm giving a recommendation in Italian, but
Your
it's
next project.
Yeah. It's Giacomini's Il Processo Stalin, which is the Stalin trial. Or we can look at other scholars who aren't as maybe as, I don't want to say reputable, but aren't as like, they have less of kind of debate around them, as Grover Furr, for example. Grover Furr really divides people into, oh, he's doing some really good analysis of these documents, or, oh, the guy is a complete hack. Hakamäki is not like that. People think that Hakamäki is a very respected scholar, but their analysis is the same. It shows that the secret speech was put together in a way that it would knock Stalin down a peg and it would allow Khrushchev to come out from that shadow, just as the CIA suspected would be necessary for that to happen.
Well, I think, as you say, it is a kind of media perception problem, and the Khrushchev speech does reframe the discourse and reframes the CIA analysis in effect as well. I mean, in some ways, the CIA is the audience for that speech as well.
Yes.
So it's really fascinating to me to see that position in as a kind of document. It raises some other interesting questions at the time. For example, in America, the Red Scare going on exactly at the same time, the McCarthy hearings, et cetera. It's
Right.
an interesting kind of contrast to see the ideological kind of debate. And you know that this speech had an effect because there's, I guess, and maybe you know more about this, one person, a lot of people, it affected a lot of people. That is, people in the party and in the depths of the party, so much so that at least one person committed suicide as a result of hearing this speech. Those are kind of really important points.
Right. Yeah, no, there is a definite audience here, but the audience is also, it's not one small group. The audience was constructed in a way that it would skew the opinion of those people who were in the Soviet governing apparatus in a way that they would work with Khrushchev on those reforms that were going to take place after 1954. Particularly in the international stage. Of course, there was many changes diplomatically, but a lot of the international decisions really changed after 1954 with Khrushchev at the helm. So, of course, one audience was the people that were present. One audience, as you mentioned, was the CIA to kind of give them this information that they would be able to use to beat Stalin with a stick. But it was not limited to the CIA, because what happens when it's not just the CIA, but what happens when an institution like the CIA gets information that is strategically beneficial to the American empire and detrimental to their strategic enemies? They, of course, will utilize that in any way that they can. They're not above. The CIA has documents that are saying that they should utilize things like abstract art to advance their goals. Like, this is, again, very well documented. They don't just look at one avenue, but if something falls into their lap, like this kind of largely falsified speech that Khrushchev delivered, they're going to utilize that information and put it out into popular consciousness to turn public perception against Stalin. And that there's a feedback loop, of course, that is meant for a US public audience that information is given to. But of course, by having all of that information out there, some of it's going to leak back into the Soviet Union. Right. And so this not so secret speech, the speech that was called the secret speech, that wasn't the formal title of it, but it's widely known as the secret speech. It was never intended to be a secret. The whole idea was that they would change the ideas of the people in the Soviet governing apparatus to work with Khrushchev. That information would get to the United States so that Stalin could be smeared there. And that information would go back and forth between the Soviet Union and the US populace to really tarnish his legacy. Because at that point, at the point of his death, he was incredibly popular, the most popular person in the Soviet Union by far. I know that people will say, well, he was the leader. Of course, he's going to be popular. But I mean, people don't understand how enthusiastically supportive people were of Stalin. If you just look at the photos of streets in random cities of Russia or other places in the Soviet Union, when Stalin died, there was a collective public mourning. I know that I had put a tweet out on the anniversary of his death this year of the streets of the city that I live in, Kazan, which is a big city. At this point, it has 1.3 million people. At the time, it had, I think, about 800,000. But if you look at the pictures of the streets, they are filled wall to wall with people weeping and consoling each other in the streets. This is a city that it has an ethnic minority as its majority, even now Kazan and Tatarstan, the republic it's in is, it's 50% Tatar. It's only 30% Russian ethnic population. At that time, it was even more ethnic, ethnic in terms of having a larger Tatar population. And it's a 12-hour highway speed drive due east of Moscow. Like it's not there where that governing apparatus is located. It wasn't even majority ethnic Russian, but the people there poured into the streets, weeping and crying and consoling each other. I said, I put the pictures out there. They're easy to find. You can see hundreds of thousands of people collectively grieving at the time that he died, even outside of places like Moscow and St. Petersburg. And so what we can see from this is that the enthusiasm of the support for Stalin in the Soviet Union was exceptionally high. And in America, the perception of Stalin was still very positive, even at that time. After the Red Scare had started, there really wasn't that dramatic drop in popularity of Stalin. That really came around once that not so secret speech kind of leaked out into popular consciousness. And then that was utilized by every anti-Soviet political scientist, historian, news outlet, businessman, and all of the governmental interests in the United States. And that was utilized over and over again to really knock, again, Stalin's reputation down a peg in the minds of the people in the Soviet Union, as well as the United States, because we have to understand Stalin was popular in the United States at that point too.
Mm-hmm.
But
John,
speaking of smear, if I may butt in.
Go ahead.
Oh, Joe.
A little kitchen update. I just wanted to give everybody an update. We've got the eggplant that we've salted to draw out the excess water, and then I've put them in a cast iron pan with a little bit of olive oil. Fry them up until they're well done. There, we're gonna set them off to cool, and then I've ground our spices and our walnut into a paste. And now I'll be adding some vinegar. It's supposed to be white wine vinegar. I've got some lovely Spanish one in place of that, and water to create a kind of slurry paste, almost like a hummus consistency. But that's where we stand so far. Oh, and I made a little reduction of blueberries with vinegar and sugar, so we'll pretty up the plate with that. And I'm sorry, so rudely cut you off there.
Thanks for the update, Joe.
I'm hungry again. Damn it.
I had a question, or
go ahead, John.
Perhaps a comment. So in the West, I'm not sure if this was done in the right after Stalin died, but certainly later on, the public grieving that was part of that was going on in the Soviet Union after Stalin died was portrayed as sort of this mass hysteria, that it was his cult of personality that was driving it, and that people had been so propagandized that this was the irrational reaction that they were having. So how do you, or how does this book address that? How do we know it was genuine grieving that was going on? Or right. That it's also suggested sometimes that it was maybe the people were forced to go out and grieve in public.
Yeah. So the latter point I can tell you is certainly not the case. So again, and I apologize for the drop in audio quality. I can only either charge my computer or use the microphone, but not both at the same time. And I don't want to drop out of the call. But in any case, Kazan, as I just wanted to mention again, is very remote from Moscow, and the presiding authority within Kazan was much more representative of the ethnic composition of the city than it was of Moscow. So to say that like moments after Stalin died, that there was this mobilization of the authority forces in Kazan would have driven them out to the streets and in all of these other ethnic cities, like it doesn't really square with the possibilities of reality. In terms of the whether people had been propagandized or not, of course, that's always a consideration. But just for comparison's sake, let's look at the United States as an example, which of course is where I grew up. We have not had, at least recently, anybody who has passed that has caused people to pour out into the streets to console each other as a result of their death. What we did have, though, and I remember it very distinctly, I was in 4th grade, was when Reagan died. We were pushed with Reagan propaganda in school. I remember it quite distinctly. We had a week of grieving for Reagan in school. They passed out literature about Reagan. They passed out, we watched documentaries about Reagan in class. There wasn't songs that used Reagan's name, but we sang patriotic songs in class in ode to Ronald Reagan for a week after he died. This is for 4th graders. Now,
What country was this?
yeah, this is the United States, right? Like, we're talking about the bastion of freedom and individuality and choice. No, we spent a week in class in a public school, mind you. I didn't go to I didn't go to some crazy religious school. This was just what the schools were doing at that time. 2004, this is what it was like. So we had a week of grieving for Reagan, not all day, but for at least a couple hours every day. We would watch a Reagan documentary. Then we would read something about Reagan and how great he was and blah, 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 blah. This is, I mean, if that's not propagandizing, they're doing that to people who are 9 years old, 10 years old. That's the definition of propagandizing. I know that it wasn't maybe quite as explicit in the broader society as it was with this kind of captive audience of children who couldn't really leave the class and just say like, F you, teacher, I don't want to sit here and sing songs for Ronald Reagan. But this was something, you watch the TV, they had Reagan's legacy on every news network for that week. It wasn't maybe as hagiographic as our portrayal in our class was, but it was something that was on even the liberal networks, like the send-off to a great president, or the send-off to, an important man in American history. I mean, this is what America was like. Even at that time, though, there wasn't this public grieving. There wasn't people who were consoling each other. So to say that the people in the Soviet Union were uniquely propagandized in a way that the people of the United States weren't, doesn't really, again, square with the experience of people who the propaganda maybe isn't as explicit, or maybe it is as explicit, who you don't really know until you experience both yourself. But I can say that in my personal experience, I could not have experienced more blatant propaganda than I received. Again, it was a captive audience of children who were being fed these Reagan stories for a week, for hours a day in class, in a public school in Michigan. This is what things were like at the time, but we didn't have public grieving. So are we not as propagandized as these people who were crying, or maybe we were more propagandized? I don't know. It's hard to say. The book doesn't directly address this, but who's to say? You can't experience it yourself. It's not really something that we can tell.
Well, I think what the book does is identify certain structural features so that we can begin to identify that same kind of issue in the United States. Currently, we have Florida trying to rewrite the middle school history programs to sanitize slavery. But we could go on that. But in terms of the media image of Stalin, that's pretty important, and I think really influential in this case, and equally important for Khrushchev to make that change. And it reminded me of the 2017 film "Death of Stalin." I don't know if you've seen that film.
I've heard of it, but I haven't seen it.
Oh, it's worth seeing because I think it will entertain you. Let's put it that way.
I'm sure.
It synthesizes many of these kinds of issues that Lacerda opens up within the book relative to terror, and it of course collapses certain historical events. The role of Zhukov and a whole variety of other things. And it's it plays for humor, but it is actually quite interesting, worth watching. I would assert. So similarly, I think we have the same kinds of issues with looking at trying to use our contemporary image of what counts as Stalin, and it's always been kind of confused. And I like the idea that there are texts that would compel us to look further. I think that's the thing about this book, is that it gives you a sense of, oh, I should know more about that. I should know about these kinds of sequences. And his opinion doesn't go over he doesn't verge off into a kind of tedious recapitulation of the terror. It is terror. I mean, it's not that it's not terror.
Just to interject briefly, Losurdo says as much. Like, I know Losurdo in the West kind of has a reputation, and this is driven in large parts by individuals like those managing editors at publishers who refuse to publish this work, of him being this dogmatic Stalinist. I mean, he was a Marxist-Leninist. He would come right out and tell you that. But to call him some like dogmatic, whitewashing, false, lying, attempt to expunge all of Stalin's sins, that doesn't square with reality, and it doesn't square with the content of this book. Like I said, I couldn't tell you how many times Losurdo would say, when he's talking about the purges or, some collectivization problems that exacerbated famines, or, etc. You can name forced removal of populations. Like, he would say, the terror, the horror, this is coming from the Marxist-Leninist Domenico Losurdo. It doesn't do us any justice to claim that there was no mistakes done. And Losurdo is willing to tell you there were mistakes that happened. So to call him some hagiography writer of Stalin, it doesn't square with what you actually see here. But when we hear the name Losurdo on Twitter, for example, you'll have people all the time who will come out and say, the guy is just a old school Stalinist who is willing to go along with anything that Stalin would have said, and et cetera, et cetera. It's not true. Examine it yourself. Go ahead. Open the book. The books are very beautiful. You can look behind me and see them. You can pre-order one right now. or for those of you who are unable to do so, we're making the PDF available for free. Like, you really don't have an excuse. The PDF will be freely available for everybody, because for us, from our perspective, it's more important for this work to get out there than to earn, 50 cents per copy. These are pretty much printed at cost. So don't think that I'm getting rich off of these books or anything like that. You can donate if you want to, but the idea here is that we need to get these narratives out there. And you should look in it for yourself, examine it for yourself. There will certainly be points where you don't agree with Losurdo's analysis. And of course, you should never agree with everything that everybody says all the time, always. Like, you are always going to have disagreements with people, even if it's somebody who you agree with on 99.9% of the things. You should never really be 100% in agreement with somebody, because it means you're not thinking for yourself. You're certainly going to find things that you disagree with Losurdo in here. I'm a Marxist-Leninist. I find things that I disagree with in here. But I find this to be a really critical work. Examine it yourself. Don't let people tell you what's in here. Don't let people tell you what to think about this book. Don't let people tell you what to think about Stalin. Take in information, synthesize that information, and then come up with your own idea of what you believe about it. This book is here as a resource for you to do that. We're not trying to make money off of this book. We're not putting this book out there to expunge everything that Stalin did. This book is a resource that I think will be very useful for anybody on the left, regardless of what you think about Stalin. Again, I'm a Marxist-Leninist. I have certain things that I'll take out of this book that are very useful to me. You can be a social democrat. You can be a Maoist. You can be a Trotskyist. You can be just a progressive liberal. It does not matter. You will find things in here that you can utilize. I think it's really important.
Black legends matter. Anyway, aside from, I'm just thinking that the average bookstore might misshelve some of the book at the first instance. But other than that, I think that, and I think actually that's an important point, is this idea of a quote unquote black legend. That is a kind of the darkness that sort of comes with invoking Stalinism is always important. But the advantage of this book is that it does, I think, see it in context, allows you to look at the details, doesn't say, you know, he allows you to take a kind of entry point into the empirical details. So I found that to be one of the biggest advantages of reading this book. And as I say, it made me go back to the timeline to see, oh, okay, when did the purges occur? Oh, it wasn't quite as long, and not as many people. I mean, people died, but it's not like what people claim.
Right. And just another thing on that. So, you know, again, people have this kind of totalizing view of Stalin, that when Stalin said something, it was like as if given by God. There was no debate. There was no other collective processes that were happening within within the government of the Soviet Union. The CIA doesn't believe that. Neither should you. I mean, if the CIA is smart enough to figure that out, us on the left should also be willing to say, if the CIA is not going with the most anti-left rhetoric, maybe there's something to it. But also, it's worth remembering that in terms of things like the purges, and I think that Lasordo could have done a better job of actually laying this point out, which is that Stalin was not like doing everything by himself. When there was an afforestation program, I bring this up specifically because my friend and co-translator Salvatore Engel-Di Mauro writes about the Soviet afforestation program in his book, Socialist States and the Environment. And the fact is, the Stalin administration was one of the best for the environment if you compare it reasonably to other states of comparative standing to the Soviet Union, and if you compare it to the things that came before the Soviet Union, if you compare it to what came after the Stalin administration was comparatively really good for the environment, which is not the narrative that's put out there. That's from a different book. You should read that one too. But the point is that Stalin, when this program was signed into law, he wasn't the one going out there with a shovel and trees and sticking them in the ground. When the order was written after Operation Barbarossa was kicked off and the Nazis started pouring over the western border of the Soviet Union, Stalin wasn't the one who went out with a wrench to disassemble the machine equipment on the front lines to move it to the east so that the Nazis wouldn't capture it and they would be able to keep producing war materials. Like, yes, Stalin put his name on an order that this should be done, but it was the upswell of popular support and the upswell of popular solidarity that these things could come by. Just signing a piece of paper that says we need to plant trees in order to, make sure that our environment is sustainable, that doesn't do it. You have to have people buying into that idea. You can't just sign a thing that says disassemble all of these machines, put them on trains and barges and ship them halfway across the world so that we can keep producing things to use in the front line in the fight against Nazism. That signing of that order does not actually do it. You have to have popular support for it and a popular will to do it. And similarly, and the reason that this is a very long explanation to get to a very simple point, with regards to the purges, when Stalin writes his name on the paper, it is not as if there is no other processes that take place between. Stalin was not the one who went out with a shotgun and just shot people in the head. This is not what happened in the period of the purges. We can say that there was many mistakes that happened in the purges, and Lasordo himself is willing to grant you this. But we have to also understand that there were other, more collective things that were going on. There were actual trials. I know people can say, well, Stalin controlled the government, so these trials were not legitimate, but there were trials that happened. Many of these people were legitimately saboteurs. In a time of war, if you're sabotaging your country, in a time of internal upheaval, if you're sabotaging the country that you live in, you would still be executed in places like the United States. This is not something that is unique to the Soviet Union and unique to Stalin. So him signing, hey, if you see somebody who is acting against the interests of the Soviet Union and, is acting in the interests of some foreign power or some internal adversary, that's something that would also happen here. We would also have purges here if that was the case. But because we don't face those same material conditions, we haven't had to grapple with that, but we would. And it's important that we keep that in mind, that it's not just this top-down, one person controls every single thing in the country. Even the CIA is willing to admit that.
Well, that's what I liked about the movie Death of Stalin. It showed the importance of people like Khrushchev or Beria in terms of decision making, and that's the reason why I actually like the film Death of Stalin, because it shows the agency, particularly after the death of Stalin, of what to do and how to organize, and the relationship, in fact, to purges and the like. Anyway. I don't know how much time you can spend left with us before you run out of power.
I can take maybe one or two more questions if you've got them.
Okay,
I've got a question.
John.
Sorry.
Joe.
Go ahead.
Did you reach out to the CIA for comment? And they still stand behind what they said.
Yeah, this is always a joke that I make on Guerrilla History. Like, hello, our resident CIA operative who's listening to the program. We hope that you're doing well today. Thank you for tuning in, and don't arrest us, please, for what we're saying. But again, the CIA, in terms of that analysis, the reason why it holds more water than what you can usually take away from what the CIA says is because it was an internal memo that wasn't directly opposed to this. It wasn't the most anti-Soviet reading of things. If they really wanted to be as anti-Soviet as they could, they would have said, yes, it was this total dictatorship. And certainly we're going to see another total dictatorship because the Soviet system is inherently dictatorial. So no matter who comes to power, whether it's Khrushchev or somebody else, we're going to see dictatorship because that's inherent to the system. That would have been what you would have expected to see from the CIA. And if you would have seen that, then you should have taken it with a grain of salt, even if it was an internal memorandum. On the other hand, what we actually saw is, hey, the narrative that is out there about Stalin being this great dictator is not true. There is collective leadership. That's not something that the CIA wants the average person to know. And that's why it was only contained within an internal memorandum until it was declassified 50 years later. And so there's a little bit more credence that we can put in that, because it's not the most anti-Soviet reading that you can imagine. And it was a non-anti-Soviet reading, I guess that's the correct way to put it, that was distributed internally in the CIA only. So, whether or not they changed their mind, they might tell you that they changed their mind, but we saw what they believed at the time. And I think that that's probably more accurate than, what they would tell you if you just asked them.
Well, they're easily led by things like money, as we've seen with
of course.
Some of the folks. So their history is a little checkered as well. John?
Yeah. So Anne and I were chatting before the conversation with you. And one thing Anne mentioned, what I thought was fascinating, was, before Lenin died, he tried to warn people about Stalin, and his widow tried to warn people. Is that addressed in this book? I didn't notice it.
Yes, it is touched on in this book. Now, okay, another criticism that I have for this book is that it should be 600 pages, not 380 pages, because the reason specifically is that, okay, in the West particularly, but also in Russia, I will let you know, there is a lot of anti-Stalin rhetoric, and they use very specific examples when they use this anti-Stalin rhetoric. And so just to clarify, that this book is not like a point-by-point rebuttal of all of the arguments that you hear about Stalin. There are other books that do similar things to that, like, hey, when you see this argument, here is reality. This really isn't that. This is, again, more of like a media analysis of the portrayal of Stalin. But in terms of that specific letter, there's a lot of debate still over the veracity of that letter, in terms of, did Lenin actually write that letter? Did Lenin intend for that letter to go out if he did write that letter? Like, every step of the process, there's still debate that's happening. And so it's a little bit hard for me to say, as somebody who's not an actual scholar of the Soviet Union, where I'm going through the archives. I've looked in the archives, but I haven't dug in the archives and done my own independent analysis. It's hard for me to say, what if everything in that chain of events is true, or if it falls apart at any individual chain, because there's debate at every individual step there. The writing of it, the giving to the wife, the the telling to the wife, because it was after his stroke, so he wasn't really able to write at that time. Whether or not he was even mentally competent enough to make that statement is up for debate. That's something that I've seen debated many times by actual historians who go into the record themselves. So I can't really say. It is touched on in this book, but while it is touched on in this book, it isn't really like deeply dove into and analyzed in the way that perhaps you and I would both like to see within this work, because that's not really what this work is doing. It's not an analysis of each individual point of complaint against Stalin, for lack of a better word in the moment. This is looking at more the media portrayal of him and the popular perception of him rather than these individual points. But he does use them as examples, and that is touched on in the book. I know that that's probably not the most satisfying answer for you, Professor, but that's what I've got for you.
Okay. All right.
That's for your next book.
We do have a question from the audience, if you'd like to.
Sure, I'll take it. We'll try to be quick with it, though.
Rodrigo.
Yes, hi Henry. I didn't finish reading the book, but I did notice that one of Domenico Losurdo's adversaries at the time published a rebuttal, and then Domenico Losurdo published a counter rebuttal.
Yes.
That did not address the point that apparently a quarter of the people who were exiled to Siberia died on the way, many of them children and old people. I do know that a lot of history has been distorted. I myself didn't know that the United States landed troops in Siberia almost as soon as the 1917 rebellion happened.
Right.
But can you address that?
Yeah. So again, this is, I know the exact conversation that you're talking about in terms of the written response to Losurdo, and then Losurdo's response to the response. And it's actually quite amusing. And in my opinion, and of course I am biased, I think that Losurdo, by and large, absolutely annihilates the French Trotskyist who he was writing with, whom I'm going to get the name for you for in 1 second, Jean-Jacques Maury. So in this back and forth, Maury's argument does not directly address the actual content of this book. It's looking for, again, these kind of cheap arguments against Stalin on these individual points, these anti-Stalin points that we hear from people that range from Trotskyists all the way to the ultra-right conservatives and everything in between. So Jean-Jacques Maury was talking about these specific things, and in many cases was utilizing sources that have been discredited in his original writing to Losurdo. Losurdo, when he responded to Jean-Jacques Maury, actually, I think in terms of orienting his responses in a way that's conducive to supporting the arguments of the book, really takes apart Maury's original response. And I'll, instead of just giving my opinion on it, I can tell you where everybody can find this back and forth. If you go to the journal Historical Materialism, you can look for Losurdo's Stalin, the debate between Jean-Jacques Maury and Domenico Losurdo, which is where I had originally seen it, because it was published in some various different places, but condensed in this specific format here from Historical Materialism. I would suggest that you read it yourself. You can see what Maury wrote about the book and then what Losurdo says about Maury's rebuttal of the book. Again, my opinion is that Losurdo completely dismantled his arguments, but what he does not do, which you mentioned, and is something that he does not necessarily do in the book, is go point by point on each of the individual allegations that is raised against Stalin. It's very important that we remember the purpose of this book. This book is not a point-by-point rebuttal of every allegation against Stalin. And it's very important that we remember that this is also not an attempt to expunge Stalin's record in its entirety. Losurdo himself says that there are mistakes of Stalin, We can learn from those mistakes. But one thing that, and this is not what Lasordo says, it's my own personal opinion, so feel free to attack me about this, is that I'm willing to concede different things depending on who my audience is. Yeah. If I'm talking with fellow, again, personally, I am a Marxist-Leninist. I know most of the listeners probably are not. That's fine. If I'm talking to a Marxist-Leninist, I will concede far more of Stalin's wrongs when I am in conversation with my fellow Marxist-Leninists than I will when I'm in a conversation with a conservative or even a Trotskyist in the case of Jean-Jacques Marie. I'm willing to concede much more when I know that somebody and I have the same ideological underpinnings and are trying to achieve the same goal, actually. When people have differing goals, you know that you're not playing on the same turf. Their goal is to go to somewhere completely different than when you are. So what we have to do is we have to think how to debate these people in a way that, yes, we understand that on this point they have something right, but we don't have to concede that to them. Again, you can disagree with me on this, but I don't think that we have to say, yes, you're right, it was evil that blah, blah, blah happened. You can do that in your internal discussions with people who have a similar ideology to you. You don't have to go out of your way and say, yes, conservatives, your this talking point is valid. Feel free to keep using this one. These ones I will debate, but this is the one that really will get me if you tell me it. So that's just my opinion. You have to think about who your audience is and what your goal is with your conversation with the individual.
That's very astute, Henry. The idea that adumbration, that is the agreement, the terrain of discourse, I think is really important. Some people just don't understand that, it's not, none of these texts are totalizing and et cetera. So, we need to have a much more agreed upon set of rules of discourse. I think we're at the end of our time, Henry. Yeah. I'm not trying to call time, but I know that you've been incredibly generous, and we appreciate it, especially in our sort of new collective organization as a kind of an autonomous collective. We are trying to move to have these kinds of discussions, and we hope that you'll come back with the next book, or if there's been another flurry like on Twitter, we'd love to be able to talk to you about that, because this is important, I think, for us. Within our group, we've been discussing a wide variety of things relative to people trying to figure out what kind of Marxist am I,
right?
And so thank you for that. John, is there anything else you would like to ask? And we should drool, I guess, at Joe's dick.
Yeah, that looks very good. I just want to thank Henry and let him know that he doesn't have to wait for another book or a Twitter fight. He can come back anytime he wants.
Well, I've got another book that's in the very early stages right now, which I'll tease a little bit. It's regarding Cuba and the blockade. That's all I'm going to say for now. It's not going to be coming out anytime soon, but just keep that in the back of your mind. And of course, in terms of Twitter fights, just wait until tomorrow. I'm sure that there's going to be something that comes up. But let me just, if you allow me to have 30 seconds to just kind of pitch this book one last time to everybody. And this, again, is not to try to make money, because we're making the PDF freely available. So, just keep that in mind. What I'm saying is actually like my personal feeling and not just personal, enrichment or anything like that. Although I will say these editions look great. Here's the hardcover for people who are looking on YouTube. There's the dust jacket off. Pretty cool. Nice. And the paperback is behind me. We've had really great pre-orders on Amazon. I know The Great Evil, don't worry, it's going to be available in other places, but this book is listed as #1 in the history category right now, over the last couple of days anyway, since it was released. So, get in now, make sure you get your copy. But I think that this book is really important, even if you only get the free PDF, doesn't matter. I don't care. I think that this book is really important, though, especially for those of us who are on the left, which I know everybody who's listening to this is. We need to be able to take this on. We need to be able to utilize the lessons of this so that we're prepared to not only debate Stalin. That is not necessarily what I think is the most important point of this book. Even though this book is all about Stalin, I don't think that utilizing this book to protect Stalin's record is the most important thing. I think that being able to use this to understand, one, how perceptions can be changed intentionally against figures on the left, very important. I think that being able to understand that, hey, maybe everything I've heard about Stalin is not necessarily true, that's also pretty important. But I think that this book is a really good study. I think that it's a very good way analytically to understand how we can analyze different discrete events in a more comprehensive way. And so my recommendation is that, in your groups, in your organizing circles, pick up a copy or two, or get the free PDF, and go into make study groups. Go over this. You don't have to agree on everything, but I think that the methodology and the analytical method within this study will really help you think about what you see in the media, what you are given, and what you are made to think by that in a way that is going to be different than you're going to see presented by other people. It's one thing to see manufacturing consent and see, yes, I understand manufacturing consent. Everybody's read manufacturing consent. Okay, now whatever. This book is a media analysis using Stalin as the example. You're not going to see that very many other places. Somebody who's going to go, toe to toe with all of the forces that come against Stalin, to use this as an example of what we should do in order to combat this, changing perceptions and how we can understand how this works. So my recommendation is to pick up a copy. And also tell people to pre-order. I think that, keep us high in the algorithm. Like I said, we were #1 in history on Amazon. I think that if you keep that up for a while, if everybody buys a copy, and like I said, they're pretty much printed at cost, so they don't cost a whole lot. If we get some more people to pick up copies, maybe this book will turn up higher when people just Google for Stalin. I don't know how algorithms work. You tell me. But I think that it's important that we have these counter narratives out there and things that'll actually be beneficial for the left rather than just straight up anti-left discourse whenever you search for anything left adjacent on the internet.
We will try and boost this as best we can. We have one more question, one last question.
Okay.
John Hayes.
Two more.
Well,
oh yes,
this question doesn't really apply to this. Since it's an opportunity. Henry, have you talked to Irritable at all in the last few years?
I have emailed him a couple of times here and there. Very hard to get a hold of him these days, but everything's all right. I still love Irritable.
We do too.
Yeah,
Joe.
great.
Yes, I have a pandemic-related question as well. But before I do, Henry, what do you think? It's not quite the traditional role.
I think it's beautiful. Like you said, it's not the traditional way. It's not what it looked like on our wedding platters, but I would eat it. I would certainly eat it. That's the most important thing.
Yeah. So basically, what I did was fry the eggplants until they're cooked through, and then pureed walnuts into a paste with garlic and fenugreek and maybe marjoram. What else was in there? Fenugreek. What else did I say? Yeah.
I highly recommend everybody. This is not just for you, Joe, but everybody should try to find blue fenugreek. It's a Georgian seasoning, and also marigold powder, another Georgian seasoning. They're like the two most important for Georgian cuisine. Blue fenugreek has an unmistakable and distinctive flavor. If you really want to make Georgian food, try to find blue fenugreek powder. It's really hard to find outside of Georgia, which is why I came back with, I probably shouldn't admit this. I don't think I declared it at customs, but I came back with plenty. Let me tell you, it was my souvenir from the trip.
Right. And then now I have one last thing. During the pandemic lockdown, I kind of got myself into a little bit of an issue. I never had long hair in my life. So
right.
Oh, this is the perfect opportunity to do it. So I said, all right, I'll grow my hair out and I'll cut it when the pandemic's officially over.
Right.
When is the pandemic going to be officially over? Because the WHO kind of didn't they downgraded but didn't officially.
Yeah.
And maybe I should just focus on cutting my hair when the next pandemic arrives.
Right.
We've
What
got
I was
avian flu and
that was pretty much what I was going to say,
virus and-
actually, is that, you know, by the time we can actually say like definitively there's no COVID anymore, we will certainly be in another pandemic at that point. So my personal suggestion would be, when it's long enough to donate, then donate it to a charitable cause. And don't worry about, you know, finding what date some declaration is made or what date the next pandemic starts. You know, find a good cause, Joe. You know, you can just do that and not worry about it at all.
Thank you.
Of course. It was a pleasure, everybody.
Yes, great to see
Thank
you.
you.
No,
Henry.
thank you so much, Henry. See you
Of course.
soon.
Take care.
Okay, Anne, did you want to
I can
yammer
begin
on a little
talking
bit about the Ukraine?
Oh, yes, I can. That was fun. This is a book that it's not necessarily, you know, it is about Stalin, but it really is more about history. It's about the way you write history and the way you can think of a specific historical figure, not in a hagiography, but in a way in which you can see when other historical events kind of occur. It's a kind of foregrounding the other important historical events and seeing them in context. And of course, there's always problematic discourse. I mean, you know, it's the same problem when you talk about the Holocaust. You know, the Holocaust has, you know, it has a certain specific ethnic group that is being destroyed, but almost twice as many people get killed for all kinds of other additional reasons. So that the whole effect is much different when you see it in this much larger, awful context. Similarly, when you compare the Gulag to the Holocaust, you can't make the same kinds of comparisons. It's problematic, but you know, one needs to just be more careful about one's analysis. And when Henry was talking about an analytic approach, I think that's what we need to do when we do any kind of historical material. It's analysis. John, did you have any comments before we move on to our other topics?
No, I think that, you know, just this kind of historical work is important because they're particularly on this type of a topic where there is so much propaganda from so many different sources, that it is important to recognize a contribution of this sort, which is not taking a side, so to speak, but looking at the entire thing in historical context. So I'm very happy we did this, and that Henry was able to join us.
I'm just glad that he came back, and this is that hopefully he will be with us as we move forward with some other new topics, and perhaps to have some other folks from guerrilla history. If you haven't heard the guerrilla history podcast, you should go over there and check it out. Rev Left and a variety of other folks are important to listen to as well. I think we're at the moment where I'm supposed to yammer on about Ukraine. That's kind of where we should go at the present moment, I guess.
Sure,
Aside
take it
from
away.
Sounds good.
looking
yeah.
at yummy food. Let me just make some general comments about Ukraine. The New York Times, the paper of record, has proclaimed that the counteroffensive is officially moving forward. I think we are still recording, and so I'm going to continue on. The key takeaways are that counteroffensive operations went on in 3 different sectors. The greatest emphasis is in the south, in the Zaporizhzhia Oblast, somewhat in the center of it. There are some counteroffensive operations in the west of this oblast. Zaporizhzhia is an important name because that's where the Europe's largest nuclear reactor campus is. It's actually a combination of 5 or 6 nuclear reactors in one place. Its power has already been co-opted by the Russians. So recovering that's going to be important, but at least recently it's not been at risk, although there's a claim that the Russians have at least surrounded it with anti-personnel mines, if nothing else. But that's, part of the disinformation or information of it. Excuse me. The counteroffensive is moving on. The thing about looking at how the Ukrainian army operates is that it never has huge major thrusts in a single direction. There is this tendency to operate in multiple locations, but unlike the Russian offense, which does take a slightly wider approach to moving forward in force, the Ukrainians have smaller sort of thrusts that have smaller encircling moments built into that thrust. I know that may not sound that different to you, but the Ukrainians operate in a kind of way in which they can smoothly coordinate these smaller thrusts together. So when you look at the map of how the advance is moving, it doesn't look like anything's happening. And then you have to go, it is like any good analytic effort, you have to go and look at least what I do is when I post my midnight thing over at Daily Kos on Ukraine, I use multiple maps. A significant number of them are Russian maps because they want to put the advances forward in the best possible light. But the advantage is when you look at that one versus something that's slightly more objective, and in that case, I'm using the Institute for the Study of War, which is a U.S. think tank, which is, right of center even. It gets money from the American Enterprise Institute. So all of these issues have a Cold War tinge to them in that sense. One can at least compare the different areas of interest and what is happening relative to where defensive positions are, relative to where movement is occurring. And it is all about movement. Excuse me. Yevgeny Prigozhin is still alive. He was in St. Petersburg a couple of days ago, and there is a Russia-Africa summit that has been meeting, and of course Prigozhin, with the interests of Wagner, his Wagner professional military corporation in Africa, doing a variety of nefarious things, including stealing gold in Sudan and a variety of other things. This is problematic for for international efforts, and particularly since Prigozhin himself is technically a war criminal and under sanction from a variety of places. But this recent Russia-Africa summit in St. Petersburg is to show that there is Niger is in a post-coup situation, and Wagner is set to step in to take some sort of place within the context of that. So you have those kinds of things going on in parallel to what the regular business of warfare. There is at least 2 other locations where forces moving forward. I mentioned the Zaporizhia Oblast, but if you go north of that on the eastern side of the front, there are small efforts moving forward, and also a small kind of recovery effort that is beginning to encircle Bakhmut, which is the area that has been fought over for the last 6 months or so, where you have originally the Russians moved forward, the Ukrainians pushed them back, and the Russians moved back forward again. And it seems like for a town that has only maybe 10,000 people in it now, or even less, it seems like a relatively small issue. But for some people, it is the gateway for Russians to move forward to in an offensive thrust to the Dnieper River. So it they can't be sort of ignored in that particular context. Also, there's a significant mine network that exists underneath the city and so it's more about the industry that is in the area. And there was word a couple of months ago that Prigozhin himself wanted to seize one of the plants for his own personal ownership, and so that is problematic. There's still there is a conscription period coming up on the Russian side, and so there's going to be slight issues of recruitment, mobilization, and other things. They have stopped shanghaiing essentially, or conscripting prisoners, and so that they may begin doing it again for the Russian army itself. The British Ministry of Defense, in their intelligence update, has indicated that that they estimate that one of the most effective Russian. I'm sorry to give you all this Russian news, but the Ukrainians talk about things in a quite different way and keep their information quite close to the vest. And the Russians, on the other hand, as kind of a part of the hybrid war doctrine, put out a lot of information. A lot of it is disinformation, and a significant number of those tend to get into reports. And so when I go through my stuff, trying to work through this, I edit out things that seem to be slightly less credible relative to front-end information. But a significant piece of equipment in this entire ground battle is the the Ka-52 Hokum attack helicopter. I know this may seem boring to you, but it is their equivalent of the helicopter gunship. The Americans' Cobra gunship and the Apache attack helicopter. And lest you think that that's unimportant, they do serve to control the battle space. And the British indicate that they have equipped these particular helicopters. They've lost 40 of them so far, so it's not like they're doing real well with them. But they are equipping them with some other weapons, other armament, which has a slightly better attack air-to-surface range. And things that I put up from last night are the scores. That is that a significant number, 2,571 rank officers have been killed on the Russian side. The Ukrainians never tell you how many have died relative to their officer corps, nor in terms of their total numbers. And the current casualty numbers, this is the Ukrainians reporting about the Russian numbers, is 244,000 casualties. Of that, something like 50 to maybe 75,000 are dead Russians. And reading the numbers off on the other details of material and tanks, etc., is probably not worth reading about, but there are new things that are going to happen. Abrams tanks, the American Abrams tank, there are two models, the A1 and A2. The A2 is the upgrade, the current version that is used in frontline American forces, but there is a significant number, 1,000 plus, of the A1 model, which doesn't have advanced sort of sighting equipment and stuff, but still has the same gun and everything. That may be transferred quickly in August. They're going to be transferred and probably on the field in September. I know that this is a kind of a war report here, but that's kind of what you get in social media and in mainstream media. Most of the reporting includes a variety of ground action that, as I said, are in these smaller locations, and there's never anything that looks like a huge thrust forward. But I think we may get that later on, and hopefully before the winter season. But this is all problematic for all the usual reasons, and we've seen what the rhythm of this war now looks like at day number 520 in this the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I know that's kind of where we are with certain of these matters. I could update you further on these. Tonight, I'll probably be opening up a little bit on other things like the war in the southwest of Ukraine, which includes Moldova, even though Moldova is essentially one country over, that is Transnistria, is the small pro-Russian sliver, the state which exists on the western edge between Moldova and Ukraine. It may seem unimportant to you, but the Russians actually have 1,500 troops sitting there, and it can be and has been seen to be problematic. Further on, and there was a report a couple of months ago that there were some moves to try and create some trouble. The Russians were going to try and create some sort of action of some kind in Moldova, perhaps with explosions or terror or something. To that end, yesterday, the Moldovans deported or kicked out a variety of Russian diplomats, probably in advance of that problem, knowing, of course, that Russian diplomats are also intelligence operatives. So there is still attention to that. Moldova's problem, of course, is that it has a very small military and does need to be defended, and is not a member of NATO. So there's a whole variety of other issues that will go on relative to Moldova. The Russians may take advantage of that. The grain, the stoppage of grain shipments from Ukraine is backing up. They've got about 30 or 40 ships backed up in one Ukrainian harbor, waiting to be loaded up. And of course, the loading docks, et cetera, have been damaged, not irreparably, but a significant number of very large, that is, in the range that is more difficult to be shot down, missiles have been launched at Odessa. And as I mentioned before, the last time you heard from me, is the cathedral in Odessa, not destroyed, but they dropped a fairly large missile into it and damaged it pretty severely. And as I say, it's going to be reconstructed by the Italians at some point in the future, once this war seems to get past. And let's see, that's pretty much where we are right now. There's no other major craziness occurring other than the Americans advising, the American government, the Pentagon, is advising people to be very cautious when talking, at least in the media, talking about the Ukrainian counteroffensive, because it has a lot of moving parts and has a lot of other problematic issues that the kind of reporting that you get is a little bit delayed, partially because the ISW, the Institute for the Study of War, tries not to compromise either side's military position. Generally, they get more disinformation and information from the Russian side, so they tend to report that. So it appears as if it's a pro-Russian thing, but they try to be somewhat neutral about it, saying that they try to corroborate the particular reporting of a position advanced in a certain geographic area. They wait for the geolocation information, among other corroborating information, before they publish it. Or if they do publish the report, they qualify it by saying they haven't seen anything that supports this particular Russian position, a Russian report on that. So that's the state of the kind of reporting. When I do my reports, I look at several different international reporting entities, whether it's, I tend to use Al Jazeera, the Guardian. And sometimes I use more conservative reporting places because often their reporting, while having a certain spin on it, often reveals more information than you would get in certain liberal outlets. So that's a bit of explanation what I do. I try to remain interested in all of the graphics being produced, noting, of course, that the map is not the territory. So you want to look at several different maps and sort of triangulate onto what might be the actual location of action or activity. Now, often that's very unpleasant because if you can actually get a geolocated thing, it's because something horrible happened at that particular location. And it's usually and if you get any visuals, you get video taken by drones, and the drones have a very, very kind of pervasive or ubiquitous kind of impact on the ways in which we see warfare. And it's actually quite explicit, probably with respect more explicit than during other wars like Vietnam or Iraq, because you oftentimes get actual battlefield interaction. And because on one side of the Russians rely on trench warfare for their defensive positions, not completely, but they do have their entrenching lines of defense are part of their deal, or their doctrine. You can actually see interaction, conflict, combat between the two sides within the trenches in a way that probably you've never seen in other wars, where you have people, you have an overhead shot, you can actually see people shooting at each other and getting killed or wounded. And it's a little problematic in that particular context.
I have a couple questions for you, Anne.
Oh, please.
Does that would that mean the trench warfare is not as effective in that case? The drones are able to delineate where they are and how to target them.
Yes, I would say that the delimiting condition is that both sides are using drones, but the Ukrainians, I think, are better organized. Both sides are using both military and commercial drones, so you have a variety of things. The Ukrainians are quite innovative about jury-rigging drones so they can drop bombs and grenades on people sitting in trenches, which is a little frightening to watch, but that's what they do. And it is accounting for, 500 to 600 people are dying a day in this war. People don't seem to, there's casualties are, the Russians aren't quite as good at it for a variety of reasons, partially because they generally are less well organized, and they're a little bit more brute force oriented. And so in the case of, rather than sending in drones, or they send drones in only to target sites, and then send a lot of artillery on top of whatever the thing is that they've sighted, rather than the Ukrainians, who tend to send drones and pick off individual soldiers or machines, vehicles, and kind of small directed activities. In other words, they'll have a drone sitting up there, because this is the video you get on the internet. You can actually see the one drone that's just simply meant to sort of sight the entire area in, and then the second drone that is actually the kamikaze drone that's coming in to kill the thing, and they edit it so you see the interspersing of a long shot of the drone looking at the vehicle, and then the drone's point of view as it closes in on the impact. So that's kind of the way the war looks. It's of course worse when you see humans getting hit by that kind of stuff.
But leads into my other question. You mentioned the disinformation war, which could be somewhat perceived as a cyber war. What about this cyber war in terms of the actual on-the-ground networking that is allowing for the drone operation and all of these things?
Well,
the Ukrainians, I have understood, are in a better situation in that respect as well.
their innovation is pretty good, but there have been some instances reported of hacking and jamming that the Russians are getting better at this. So there have been, counter jamming and other stuff. But at the beginning of, or at sort of in the middle of the conflict, the Ukrainians reported that they had 10,000 drone operators dispersed among their troops. So I assume that every brigade has X number of drone operators assigned to particular units. The Russians aren't quite so well organized. And the problem is, of course, the networking problem of trying to coordinate drone activity with the other network activity. That is, when you have artillery sighted in and it fires off, you have the possibility of counter battery radar operating to return fire at the exact location from the originating artillery. And sometimes that's not as well coordinated with other pieces of information, but this whole network war thing is actually really important. It is part of both armies' doctrine. Originally, the Russians have in their hybrid war doctrine include this whole cyber component as a subunit or as a secondary layer after the hybrid thing. Is also a largely manipulating information and disinformation. In the American doctrine, there is a component of cyber, but I think it operates differently. And in the long run, the Americans will have a technology that promotes a certain type of drone warfare that is in the advanced version of the F-35. The network that they use to each F-35 should be able to operate several unmanned drones at the same time. So you have the kind of weird network war. The current version of this is the missile attacks, where the Russians are sending these cheaper fleet of these cheaper drones, these Iranian type drones, in to sort of flood the radar at the front end so that it tricks the Ukrainians into sending a lot more ordnance at these things and hopefully expending the expensive Ukrainian countermeasures. And then after this initial barrage, they send in a much more serious missile, which is more expensive, et cetera. And I think that was what happened in Odessa, where the front end, they send in all these smaller Iranian drones, which are essentially run by a kind of a moped engine, and then sent a really big missile in. They've been running daily sorties of about four or so. These are Tu-22 backfire bombers, and each one can carry two very large cruise missiles. And these, anyway. The point being is that they do this every day, it seems. They send up a couple of bombers that do not cross into Ukrainian airspace, and then they launch their missiles from in the air from beyond the Ukrainian border. And unfortunately, and this is where the war can and should change, is to begin to attack Russian fighters and bombers beyond the border of Ukraine, and which is what makes America nervous about giving them, equipment on the one hand. On the other hand, that's exactly what they should be doing. And the Ukrainians have tried to make do with that by occasionally sending a missile far into Russia. They did that a couple of weeks ago when they sent to the south. There's a bunch of bases that are west of Sochi and beyond the Sea of Azov, and they've been hitting ammunition sites there. And similarly, the HIMARS missiles that they have they've been using to bomb specific ammunition sites, and they hit 2 or 3 of those in Crimea a couple of days ago.
So when you say beyond the Ukrainian border, you're talking about specifically targeting within Russia.
Yes. The whole issue of attacking and hitting things in Russia, Ukraine rarely admits that they did it. I mean, they obviously did it, but officially they say, well, we don't know what the hell happened. So there have been a couple of fuel facilities that get hit. They have actually been hitting things, but not the same volume as the Russians are in terms of attacking Ukraine. It's always going to be the case, and it's sad to think of that, but I think that affects the analysis that the Russians always have more stuff. It's just that they're not quite able to use it as well. But yet they still have so much stuff that they can sort of do this thing like where they've got these bombers, on the other side of the border launching their missiles. There's not much you can do except track them and see and prepare a defense for them. And as I said, there's a bunch of missiles that either go faster or have more problematic signatures that are more difficult to hit. And the Ukrainians tend to knock down something like 75% of them, or sometimes they're lucky and they get all of them, but the couple that get through are the ones that always wind up on the reports. That X number of sites, like that cathedral in Odessa, get hit, and everyone gets mad because it was a significant site, but it wasn't a military site, so we get even more annoyed because the Ukrainians are pretty scrupulous about not hitting civilian sites. That whenever they hit something that's in the, for example, in Donetsk, in the Donetsk Republic area behind the lines, it's usually to try and assassinate somebody. And it's not a matter of assassination so much as they've targeted a place where they have good information where somebody is, and then they just hit that thing. So they do hit a civilian target, but it's really targeted. It's more precise in that sense. Whereas the Russians, they just, they launch stuff against apartment buildings because some of the weapons are not as accurate.
One last question regarding Russian dissidents or people fighting within Russia against the war. What's that look like in terms of the sabotage and resistance to the state's ongoing?
Well, we haven't had very much recent reports about that. There's certainly enough targets. There has been arson, and we don't know whether they're from people who are anti-Putin or are Ukrainians. Now that's been made unclear. In some cases, the Ukrainians don't like to cop to whether they did it or not. And there are some anti-Putin anarchist groups that spend time mainly disabling railway facilities. So they'll blow up a control point or something in terms of railway infrastructure. They're not blowing up the trains themselves so much as they're attacking little, like any resistance movement, they're attacking infrastructure. The other stories are not as well reported, and I think there's more than we expect. That may just simply be a normal miscalculation, but we haven't heard much about the neo-Nazi groups that Russia uses in their operations. Much like we don't have a real sense of what goes on in these Wagner and there are other professional military corporations fighting on the Russian side. There's just a lot of unattended stories in that. But in the Russian case, there haven't been any of those big arsons that we were hearing a couple of weeks ago. And maybe it's just simply because the Russians are getting better at ferreting out who's trying to set fire to some of their large factories, which is generally what was happening. Large factories, and in one case, a shopping center, but it's nothing it's not as pervasive, or perhaps it's not being as well reported on. And so that's kind of what's going on the Russian side. Other than the usual things that they're working on, which is they're probably doing, there have been reports of greater conscription stuff where they're just grabbing people and, you know, but they've been doing that consistently. And I think that's part of their regular modus operandi, partially because they moved from a 2-year conscription to a 1-year conscription for military service. And also there's flight, you know, people have just split from Russia until the war is over. And that's been an issue as well. So, you know, you've got a lot of police work going on in that case. That's about all I know now. You know, this Prigozhin thing is not as clear as one had hoped, and has a lot of little complications in it. Needless to say, I think they are rebasing Prigozhin's Wagner group into Belarus. And to what end, I'm sure CIA knows, but you know, it's complicated relative to Lukashenko, who to all intents and purposes, hopefully he passes away in office, and then perhaps an actual election can occur. But you know, he rigged his last election to stay in power, and so I would assert that there's a significant opposition, but that one that is waiting him out in Belarus, and whether Wagner has a role to play in that will be an interesting problem to see in the future.
Great. Well, thanks for that. Thanks, John.
I-
John, did you have any follow-up?
Nope. Just wanted to thank Anne for that thorough update of happenings in Ukraine.
just filling the time. I guess it's good because you just accumulate all these stupid factoids and I just crank them out.
No, I think that you know, you shared a lot more information than most people would get if they went looking for it from the major news sources. So I thank you.
Well, it's my little labor of love, I suppose, that I put this thing up every night. I'm getting not famous for it, perhaps infamous, but some people expect me to put the goddamn thing up every midnight, and they get mad if I miss the time. So
Always be generating content.
520 days of it in a row. So I haven't missed yet. I was 4 hours late at one moment and whatever, but if you want to watch my, I don't do the best stuff over there, of course. Coast does the best. Coast and Mark Sumner do the best reporting. They have the regular people on the beat of the updates, and they publish during the day. I just put out a little thing because it fits during the time when they're not writing. That's kind of why I do what I do. And I chose the time because nobody else was writing about it at the time. So I figured, oh, well, there's a lot of data available at the time. Why don't I put that up there so people who are just waking up in places like Ukraine can actually see an accumulated, compendium of some of the news. So that's kind of why I do it. And it's not so much a labor of love. I don't have a particular, I don't like seeing people invaded. I guess that's pretty much where I am with this. It's really, I thought it was going to be over quickly in one sense, but I like many other people, misunderstood the quality of the Russian army.
These types of things tend to last longer than expected in almost every case.
Well, it's driven by a lot of other things, and as I've said before, not to be overly economically determinist, but it's still about the industrial complex, the military industrial complex, and as I mentioned before, I can't remember if it's the Slovaks or the Czechs are transferring helicopters to the Ukrainians, but what's going to replace them? Well, American helicopters and gunships. So
Nice.
it's going to be America's going to get a little economic bump from this war.
Mm. Well, on that note, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. I hope you enjoyed the preparation of the stuffed eggplant with the walnut pate. We made a
Yum.
couple extra ones there. And we're doing this every week. You can take the link on the down below to the autonomouscollective.net. You can register for our newsletter. We do the show every Friday at 7 o'clock. I do 100% vegetarian dishes while the professors yammer on, and we chit chat with other people, comedians, and politicians, and have wonderful discussions. So please join us.
Thank you, Joe. And you did say you were going to send that via FedEx to me, so I'll have it for tomorrow.
Right.
Okay, good. I'd also like to encourage people to join the Autonomous Collective. If you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see a link on our YouTube channel, and that will connect you to our newsletter. Sign up for that, and that will give you instructions on how to join us. We present content every day of the week, it seems. So always something going on. It's not 24 hours a day, but it is 7 days a week. And join us. We're an interesting group of people who come together to discuss political, economic, social issues, as well as to enjoy each other's company and have some fun. So please join us.
Oh, we shouldn't sell Prof. John short. In 30 minutes, going to be Twilight Zone.
That's right. We will be looking at a classic episode of The Twilight Zone. Tonight's episode, the teleplay, was written by none other than science fiction legend Ray Bradbury. So join us for an analysis of that and all sorts of fun stuff happening. And now for our closing credits.